The last thing anyone expected on our sleepy suburban street was to see the state's governor stepping out of my modest living room with a grim expression and a stack of HOA paperwork under his arm. But that unbelievable image is exactly how the day ended, and the chain of events that led there began with a single envelope shoved into our mailbox. To outsiders, our neighborhood looked perfect. Rows of identical lawns trimmed with military precision and flower beds that could have been copied from a landscaping catalog. But beneath the veneer simmered a quiet tyranny enforced by Sylvia Wexler, the longtime HOA president who had turned rules meant for harmony into weapons for control. For 5 years, my disabled mother and I had kept our heads down, grateful to have secured a home with a gently sloped ramp that gave her access to the world again after the car accident shattered her legs and her independence. That ramp was more than wood and nails. It was her freedom, her dignity, the simple doorway to grocery runs, doctor visits, and sunsets on the porch without fear of a fall. We had installed it carefully, pulled permits, and followed codes because we knew how unforgiving Sylvia could be. Yet as I unfolded the letter on that bright Sunday morning, my stomach tightened at the bold header declaring our ramp a non-compliant structure and warning that unless it was removed within 30 days, escalating fines and potential eviction would follow. My first reaction was disbelief, quickly replaced by anger, and beneath that anger, a flicker of fear, because Sylvia's reign of intimidation had already cost neighbors thousands in fines for trivialities as small as a wind chime that squeaked too loudly or a bird feeder an inch too low. Mom, unaware of the brewing storm, sipped her coffee near the window, her wheelchair wheels catching a glint of sunlight, and the sight hardened my resolve. I could not let her be humiliated or trapped in her own home because someone wanted to flex authority. As the day stretched on, my mind replayed every quiet warning whispered at block parties about Sylvia's ruthless tactics. The single father fined for leaving a basketball hoop visible overnight, the retired couple pressured into repainting shutters 3 times for being too cheerful a shade of blue. This was bigger than petty control. It was the weaponization of community rules against the vulnerable, and now it had landed squarely on my family. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, combing through the HOA bylaws and state accessibility statutes, and the deeper I read, the more I saw Sylvia's letter for what it was, a bluff built on selective reading and ignored protections. Buried in the fine print was a clause about reasonable accommodations for disabilities, mirrored by state law that explicitly shielded structures like ours. But experience had taught me that bullies don't retreat when confronted with facts. They escalate. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange over our quiet street, I imagined Sylvia already plotting her next move, perhaps whispering to her loyalists that I was reckless or disrespectful of property values, priming them for a spectacle at the next HOA meeting. I could almost feel the weight of community opinion tilting, the same way fear had kept so many silent before. Yet under that fear, something sharper sparked, defiance. I thought of every late-night sanding session on the ramp's rails to make sure Mom's hands never caught a splinter, of the neighbors who had quietly smiled seeing her glide down it with her head held high, of the hard-won stability we had built here. Sylvia might have thought we were an easy target, a caregiver son too busy and a disabled mother too quiet to fight, but she had underestimated just how far I would go to protect her dignity. The irony was that in trying to force us out, she had set in motion a sequence that would expose her hypocrisy, rally the neighborhood, and bring the state's highest office to our doorstep. By the time I closed the laptop and looked over at Mom laughing softly at a rerun on TV, the stage for a battle far larger than a ramp violation had been set. What began with a letter meant to intimidate would end with Sylvia's authority crumbling, the community's fear dissolving, and the governor himself crossing our threshold, proof that even the smallest home can become the center of a storm when justice is on the line. By Monday morning the entire street already seemed to hum with whispers, proof of how quickly news traveled when Sylvia Wexler wanted it to. Her inner circle, the same neighbors who always appeared at her side during block parties and who treated her clipboard like a crown jewel, had clearly been briefed because their sideways glances followed me as I wheeled my mom down the ramp for her physical therapy appointment. The weight of their judgment pressed against my shoulders, yet behind their polite smiles I sensed curiosity and unease. as though they were waiting to see if I would quietly dismantle the ramp or stand my ground. At work that day, I could barely focus, my mind replaying every story of Sylvia's past vendettas, each one ending with a neighbor capitulating rather than face the HOA's endless barrage of letters, fines, and threats of litigation. But unlike those who had folded, I had something they didn't: clear legal protections and a purpose bigger than pride. As soon as Mom was settled after therapy, I spent hours cross-referencing county records with state accessibility laws, printing highlighted pages into a binder thick enough to rival Sylvia's infamous violation folder. I discovered not only that ramps for disabled residents were explicitly protected, but that the HOA bylaws contained an amendment requiring the board to make reasonable accommodations, an amendment Sylvia herself had signed years earlier as secretary. Before she seized the presidency, the hypocrisy burned brighter with every page I read. I also found budget reports showing questionable expenses, maintenance fees that mysteriously ballooned under her tenure, landscaping invoices marked up beyond market rates, which suggested Sylvia's reign wasn't just authoritarian, but potentially self-serving. As I built my case, I reached out quietly to neighbors I trusted, testing the waters to see if anyone else had grown tired of Sylvia's heavy-handed control. Bob from 2 doors down admitted she had fined him for leaving recycling bins out 20 minutes past collection, while the Martins whispered that she had forced them to remove a backyard swing set because it disrupted the neighborhood's visual harmony. One by one, the stories tumbled out, each more absurd than the last, and with them came a growing sense that the community's fear of Sylvia was brittle, held together only by the perception that she was untouchable. Over the following days, Sylvia escalated her campaign against us, slipping additional notices into our mailbox citing fabricated violations like excessive ramp length and unsightly handrails, even claiming our front porch planter violated color codes. The paper attacks stacked on the kitchen counter like fallen leaves, each one more desperate than the last. Yet the more she pushed, the more resolve hardened in me. I began documenting everything: photographs of the ramp, timestamps of deliveries, copies of state guidelines, to build an airtight defense and, if necessary, an offense. Late one night, as I reviewed the HOA meeting schedule, I realized a perfect opportunity loomed: the upcoming community session where Sylvia would undoubtedly attempt to humiliate us publicly to cement her control. If I could present my evidence there, not only would I shield my mom, but I could shatter the illusion of Sylvia's authority before the entire neighborhood. To strengthen my position, I contacted a local disability rights group, explaining the situation and sharing copies of the notices. They responded swiftly, offering guidance and even mentioning that one of their board members had close ties to the governor's office due to recent accessibility initiatives. The possibility that our fight might reach the highest levels of state government startled me, but also ignited hope. By the time the HOA meeting approached, a subtle shift had begun on our street. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now offered hesitant nods or quiet words of encouragement when Sylvia wasn't looking. The Martins left a pie on our doorstep with a simple note: "Stay strong." Even the usually reserved Bob lingered near our driveway to mutter that he was rooting for us. Sylvia, meanwhile, strutted past our house each afternoon, her sharp heels clacking like warning shots, clipboard held high, pretending not to notice the small cracks forming in her support. The tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with each passing day, and I knew the showdown was coming. What Sylvia couldn't see was that her attempt to crush us had already spiraled beyond her control, drawing in allies, attention, and a quiet but growing outrage that would soon eclipse her intimidation. The stage was set not just for a neighborhood dispute, but for a reckoning that would ripple far wider than she imagined. And though the governor's unexpected visit was still weeks away, the first tremors of that moment were already shaking the foundations of her power. The night of the HOA meeting arrived under a sky heavy with storm clouds, the kind that seemed to hold their breath before a downpour, and the atmosphere inside the community hall matched the weather outside: charged, expectant, and brittle. Folding chairs lined up in neat rows faced a long table draped in a bland white cloth. The HOA board members seated like magistrates with Sylvia in the center, her shoulders squared and her expression fixed in what she no doubt believed was regal composure. The neighbors shuffled in, their voices hushed yet tinged with curiosity, some leaning toward each other to exchange speculations about the ramp, others casting furtive glances toward me and my mom, who had bravely come despite the discomfort of public scrutiny. The ramp violation was clearly meant to be Sylvia's showcase, her chance to remind everyone that she alone maintained order, but the subtle undercurrent was different tonight. The nods I received from Bob, the Martins, and even a few who had previously avoided me hinted that Sylvia's hold was already weakening. As the meeting progressed through mundane items like landscaping budgets and community event schedules, I felt the weight of the binder on my lap, the highlighted statutes, printed bylaws, and photographs representing hours of preparation. When the topic finally shifted to non-compliant structures, a palpable tension settled over the room, and Sylvia's voice, syrupy with feigned concern, described our ramp as an unfortunate blight that endangered property values. The board members beside her nodded mechanically, but a few eyes flickered uncomfortably toward my mom's wheelchair. I remained silent, letting the theatrics build, knowing that timing would be everything. When Sylvia moved to propose a vote on fines and removal, I rose deliberately, the rustle of papers loud in the quiet room, and walked forward, my heart pounding but my mind clear. Instead of panic, I felt a calm defiance, because I understood. Now that bullies wield power only when people believe in it. I placed the binder on the table with measured care, opened to the section on accessibility accommodations, and calmly laid out the statutes that guaranteed my mom's right to reasonable modifications. Gasps rippled through the room as I revealed that Sylvia herself had signed the HOA amendment affirming those protections years ago, evidence that cut through her facade like a blade. Then I exposed the questionable expenses I had unearthed, the inflated landscaping invoices and unexplained budget gaps, not to accuse her of theft outright, but to sow the seeds of doubt about her stewardship. Murmurs grew louder, and I could sense the neighbors recalibrating their opinions, realizing that Sylvia's authority rested more on intimidation than legitimacy. The tension broke entirely when a representative from the disability rights group, whom I had quietly invited, stepped into the room, his presence a visible sign that outside eyes were now watching. His introduction, mentioning ongoing discussions with state officials about accessibility enforcement, sent a shiver through the board, and I could see Sylvia's composure falter, the faintest tremor in her hands as she clutched her papers. Though no vote was taken that night, the room's mood had shifted irrevocably. Neighbors who once cowered now whispered openly, some even patting my shoulder or offering smiles as they filed out, leaving Sylvia behind her table, isolated beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Over the next days, the neighborhood's dynamics transformed subtly but unmistakably. Conversations that had been careful and coded grew bolder, and small acts of quiet rebellion emerged. A bird feeder reappeared in Bob's yard, the Martins rehung their cheerful blue shutters, and a family down the street parked a camper in their driveway without fear. Sylvia responded with a flurry of violation notices, but they landed with less weight now, crumpled and discarded rather than obeyed. Rumors of her mismanagement spread, and whispers of a recall vote began circulating. Behind closed doors, I continued to fortify our position, consulting the disability rights group and sending a concise yet thorough report to the governor's office, not expecting a direct response, but hoping to add pressure on the HOA to comply with the law. What I did not anticipate was how seriously the report would be taken, nor how quickly events would escalate. Less than 2 weeks later, a black SUV with state plates slowed in front of our modest home, and though the man who stepped out did not yet identify himself, the discreet security detail and the respectful nod he gave me as he approached were unmistakable indicators that our fight had reached far beyond Sylvia's grasp. The storm clouds that had gathered for weeks were about to break in a way that would leave the entire neighborhood stunned and the governor himself walking through our doorway. When the black SUV's door swung open and the governor himself stepped onto our driveway flanked by 2 aides, the neighborhood seemed to collectively hold its breath. Curtains twitched, blinds tilted, and phones discreetly appeared at windows as residents strained for a glimpse of the spectacle unfolding before them. The very woman who had treated herself as sovereign of this cul-de-sac was suddenly just another onlooker as the highest elected official in the state crossed my threshold. Inside, the governor's presence transformed our modest living room. into the unlikely epicenter of a statewide conversation on fairness and accessibility. His aide scanned the HOA letters, my binder of evidence, and the photos of our ramp with quiet efficiency, while my mother sat near the window, her hands clasped tightly, the weight of months of humiliation pressing invisibly on her shoulders. Outside, Sylvia hovered on the sidewalk, her once proud posture wilting as murmurs spread among neighbors who now looked to her with something between disbelief and disappointment. The governor listened intently to the summary of events I provided, nodding at the clear violations of disability accommodation laws and raising an eyebrow at the questionable financial practices documented in the HOA's own reports. His aides marked notes for potential investigations into the board's conduct, signaling that what had been a localized abuse of power might soon become a formal inquiry. Word traveled quickly. A pair of reporters arrived, tipped off by someone watching the street, their cameras catching Sylvia's unease and the stunned faces of residents who had once whispered their complaints in secret. By the time the governor emerged again, the storm had broken, not on the weathered shingles of our homes, but on the fragile edifice of fear Sylvia had built. He thanked us for bringing the issue to light, assured the watching neighbors that state law unequivocally protected accessibility accommodations, and reminded the community that HOA boards serve the residents, not themselves. As he left, a cheer erupted spontaneously from Bob and the Martins, quickly joined by others who had felt powerless for so long. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The ramp Sylvia had called an eyesore now stood as a beacon of justice, and the woman who had wielded her clipboard like a weapon now shrank into the background, stripped of her aura of control. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and dramatic. The HOA board convened an emergency session, and a motion for a vote of no confidence in Sylvia's leadership passed almost unanimously. Her resignation letter appeared in mailboxes 3 days later, its formal language unable to mask the humiliation beneath. The disability rights group leveraged the incident to propose new state-level guidelines, ensuring no other family would endure what we had. Local news stations replayed footage of the governor stepping out of our door alongside shots of my mom, smiling tearfully on the ramp, turning our quiet struggle into a rallying cry for fair treatment. The neighbors, freed from Sylvia's iron grip, began to reclaim their individuality. Flower beds bloomed in unconventional colors, children's laughter returned to yards, and conversations on sidewalks were no longer hushed. As for us, the change was deeper than the absence of violation letters. For the first time in years, my mom wheeled herself onto the porch without glancing anxiously at the street, her shoulders relaxing as if a long-held weight had been lifted. The ramp gleamed in the afternoon sun, a simple structure of wood and bolts that had become the symbol of an entire neighborhood's liberation. Standing there beside her, I realized this had never been only about a ramp or even about one overzealous HOA president. It was about the quiet strength found in refusing to bow to injustice and the extraordinary reach a small act of resistance can have when seen by the right eyes. The governor's visit faded from headlines eventually, but its echo remained in the way neighbors now greeted each other, in the way Bob left his recycling bins out overnight without fear, and in the way the Martins painted their shutters the brightest shade of blue they could find. Power, I learned, is fragile when it is built on intimidation, and community is strongest when it stands for those who cannot always stand for themselves. My mother kept her ramp. The neighborhood reclaimed its freedom, and the image of the governor stepping out of our living room became a lasting reminder that even the smallest house on the quietest street can shake the foundations of authority when the cause is just and the will to fight is unwavering.